Imagine waking up in the 1960s, a decade remembered for music, fashion, television, and youth culture. A time of color, confidence, and the feeling that the old world was finally being challenged. But everyday life in the 1960s was more complicated than the image suggests. It was a decade of change, of young people becoming more visible, of television shaping public life, of new homes, technology, and ambitions, of women questioning expectations, of immigrants helping rebuild society while facing racism and discrimination, of Cold War fear, nuclear anxiety, and political unrest. The 1960s were not one single experience. A teenager in London lived differently from a miner in a northern town, or a student at university. The 1960s looked modern. But underneath, society was being pulled in different directions. The 1960s did not begin as suddenly as the popular image suggests. It felt close to the 1950s. Daily life was shaped by work, family, school, church, and respectability. Many homes were still modest. Class still affected where people lived, what work they could get, and what society expected of them. But there was also a growing sense that life could become more comfortable. Consumer goods became available. New housing changed skylines. For some, the decade brought choice. For others, poverty and limited opportunity remained. Home life remained central. The ideal of the stable family still carried huge power. Respectability was a sign of success. Television became a focal point. Families gathered for news, comedy, and national events. The home was connecting to the world. But family life was changing. Young people increasingly had their own tastes, music, and sense of identity. Parents valued discipline and security. Their children grew up in a world of records, magazines, and new freedoms. The result was often tension. Inside the traditional-looking 1960s home, the future was beginning to argue with the past. Work continued to define daily life. Factories, mines, and docks shaped the rhythm of the week for millions. Office work expanded. More people could imagine buying a car or owning a home, but class still mattered deeply. Class shaped education, speech, and social mobility. Many found their lives restricted by background and money. More women worked outside the home, in shops, offices, and hospitals. But pay and status were rarely equal. One of the strongest images of the decade is youth culture. Teenagers became a powerful cultural force. Pop music, rock bands, and television programs helped create a shared youth identity that felt entirely new. In Britain, groups like the Beatles were part of a wider shift. Fashion became bolder, hair longer, and skirts shorter. But this wasn't everyone's experience. Not everyone could afford the new style, and many older people disapproved. For women, the 1960s brought new questions about work, education, marriage, and independence. Traditional expectations remained powerful. Many were still expected to marry and manage the home above all else. But change was building. Conversations about equal pay, contraception, and independence became harder to ignore. The decade did not free women from pressure, but it did make more women ask why that pressure existed. The 1960s were also shaped by immigration and the struggle for equality. Communities from across the Commonwealth arrived. Immigrants helped staff public services, hospitals, and factories, yet many faced racism, hostility, and poor housing. The image of freedom did not apply to everyone. Protest movements challenged older systems of power across the West. The 1960s were about who had a voice, who was listened to, and who was still being pushed to the margins. Technology made the decade feel fast. The space race gave the 1960s a truly futuristic imagination. Rockets and satellites made people feel a new age had begun. The moon landing in 1969 was a defining global moment. Modern life changed in quieter ways too. Cars became common, roads expanded, and air travel became more visible. Technology promised freedom and progress, but it also made the world feel louder, faster, and harder to escape. The 1960s were full of optimism, but also fear. The Cold War remained a constant, heavy background pressure. Nuclear weapons made the future feel uncertain. Politics was no longer distant. It arrived in the living room every night. The Vietnam War became a major source of division and protest, shaping how an entire generation understood power. Assassinations and unrest challenged the idea of progress. The 1960s were exciting, but they were deeply unsettled. Looking back, the 1960s can seem like a decade of color, music, and the belief that the future had finally arrived. But everyday life was more complicated. It was a decade of opportunity and inequality, of freedom and restriction. It was a time of women questioning expectations and immigrants helping build a society that didn't always welcome them. Television brought the world home, whether that world was exciting, frightening, or impossible to ignore. The 1960s did not change everything for everyone, but it changed what people believed could be questioned. It was the decade where the modern world stopped waiting in the background and started demanding to be seen.